So let me introduce today's speakers. We have a brilliant panel joining us today. First, our Senior Director of Neuroscience Research, who has been instrumental in ensuring that NLI follows the neuroscience and our frameworks, perspectives, and solutions, Dr. Khalil Smith. Hi, Cami.
Hi,
there you are.
Hello, everyone. Hi.
Thanks for joining us today. Good to see you. Our second subject matter expert is PhD and Professor of Psychology at Lehigh University, Dominic Packer.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Dominic. Thanks for joining us. Dominic studies how social groups shape our identities, our decisions, and our lives, which makes him a perfect guest for today's conversation. And today's session will be facilitated by NLI's VP of Consulting, Practices, and Research, Mr. Khalil Smith. Hello, Khalil.
Hey, Gabe. How are you?
Good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Khalil has expertly guided NLI's approach to allyship, authoring a number of articles on the topic and advising clients on how they can approach it. So Khalil, with that, I think I'm going to hand off to you to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sound good.
Perfect. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see in the chat all of the incredible places from which people are joining. So we are humbled to have you with us. And I know a number of folks will be listening to this as a part of a recording as well. So thank you. And hopefully you're well wherever you are when you're hearing us. We have lots to get to today. And for any of you that have been with us on this journey, you know that we'll kind of bounce in and out of some slides. We'll have lots and lots of conversation with Cami and Dominic. We'll look very frequently at the chat to understand what are some of the things that are kind of coming out for you. We're also going to have some polls and some opportunities for you to really kind of dig in. But first, I just kind of want to frame up a little bit of what we're going to talk about today in addition to what Gabe spoke about. So this idea of uniting widely, first and foremost, if you spend any time around NeuroLeadership Institute, you know our primary guidance is always going to be to follow the science. And so we do that. We're going to continue to do that as a part of this webinar. And that science and that point of view led us to what Gabe described and what you will have seen in the session that we hosted last week, where we talked about listening deeply. So we created an article, Dr. David Rock, our CEO and co-founder, and myself wrote this back in kind of early June to help leaders understand what needed to be done right now. What are the habits that can really be influential today? And so we talked about listen deeply last week, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those insights, talking about unite widely this week, and then next week we'll be talking about how to act boldly and what is the science behind acting boldly. And so for any of you that were not with us last week, we had an incredible group. So Barbara, Paulette, and Michaela really walked us through quite a bit. I would encourage you to look at that recording, listen to that recording if you can. But one of the things that we called out is that there are really a handful of places and kind of ways that we can be listening, right? One is one-on-one, one is in teams, and one is across the organization. And throughout various conversations, we've actually been doing quite a bit of polling to understand what's going on in organizations. And so as you can see, one of the things that we asked is what best describes your organization's response to conversations about racial equality? And what we see here is that 42% are saying that really the thing that their organizations have done has been either their CEO or some level of senior executives posting public statements about racial equality or kind of our current situation and instances. We see about half of that in the place of either encouraging team and one-on-one conversations or exploring a plan of action. So again, we can get down into, well, the listening deeply, right? That's the team and one-on-one conversations that we were just looking at. The plan of action is that kind of acting boldly that we're going to talk about next week. And then town halls is about 12%, and folks that said we actually maybe haven't done much and we're uncertain of how to move forward was 4%. Now, as we talk about town halls here, one of the things that we spoke about last week as well is that organizational listening takes place in a number of different facets, right? There are listening circles, there are focus groups, there are town halls, and there are surveys. There are some things that kind of fall in between these, but these are really kind of the four major buckets. And each of these can be absolutely right depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And so understanding what it is that we're trying to do is critically important to understanding which of these methodologies or modalities is going to be most beneficial. And so along those same lines, we asked another question: what best describes your perception of how equipped managers are with leading sensitive conversations? So if we want to be doing these things, we have to ask the question of how adept are our managers at being able to do this? And only 4% of us thought that our managers are highly skilled and capable of reaching clear outcomes. About the same percent, so about 70 to 75% total, felt like the managers are either somewhat skilled but need some additional coaching, or relatively unskilled but willing to learn. And then there was 22% that said they're unskilled and probably want to steer clear of these because they're really challenging, and or there is some degree of threat or fear associated with these conversations. And so part of what we want to do today, and what we did last week and what we'll do next week, is continue to help leaders understand what you can do to be really effective in having these conversations, to reduce that overall level of threat, and to reach really positive and intentional outcomes. And so to come back to this frame of listen deeply, unite widely, and act boldly. And so one thing that I want to do before we really start diving in, because I've got lots and lots of questions, Cami and Dominic, for you. So please get ready, because I'm going to be peppering you with a lot of these. And I know we'll see a lot in the chat as well. So please, folks, continue to put your questions in the chat. And as Gabe said, as you're writing down your insights, also put some of those insights in the chat, because it's also useful to be able to react to those in real time. But, this quote kind of jumps out at, I think, a number of us, and definitely at me as well. Maya Angelou: in minor ways we differ, in major we're the same. So we're going to talk a little bit about how do you bring that together? How do you do that without reducing the distinctiveness or the uniqueness of any of the folks in your organization, and yet still bring people together and unite widely? And when we talk about uniting widely, I really wanted to just anchor us on this idea that it's about bringing our organizations to a set of shared goals around addressing big human rights issues. There are lots of other things that we can be uniting around, but really wanted to anchor on this for this particular conversation. And so the first thing I'm going to do is, Gabe, if it's okay, I'm going to ask you to put up a poll. And for everyone that's on, would love for you to just kind of start getting active with us and answer this question. I believe our efforts to unite widely have been very unsuccessful, been moderately unsuccessful, had no effect, been moderately successful, or been very successful. And I'll give us about 30 more seconds to fill this out, because I think it'll really help us to understand where we're all starting from, and to frame up some of the conversation that we're just about to get into. So I'll give about 15 more seconds. I see the numbers climbing on folks that are getting in there, which is great.
And Khalil, while people are answering that, just a couple clarifying questions coming in the chat. Does this apply to our organizations, or more broadly as a culture? And a couple of people asking to define uniting widely again.
Yeah, so the question specifically is for your organization, and the uniting widely, the definition that we're going to kind of anchor on for this particular conversation and for what we've been talking about, is bringing your organization to a set of shared goals around addressing big human rights issues. So that's what we're thinking of when we're thinking of uniting widely. And we'll talk more generally around shared goals and how to get people just aligned around virtually anything. And yet the genesis of the article, the genesis of a lot of this conversation is around racial inequity, the George Floyd murder, what we're talking about right now as it relates to kind of civil rights and social unrest. So I really want to anchor there. Thanks, Gabe. Great call out.
Thanks, Khalil. And I'm going to share the results there.
Perfect. All right, so about 55% said that we've been moderately successful in our organizations. Only 3%, which is, I like that, seeing only 3% feel like they've been very unsuccessful. And about 16% no effect, 22% been moderately successful. But on the opposite side of been very successful is kind of the inverse, right? Only about 4% of us feel like we've been very successful. So definitely quite a bit in that middle, which I think is, again, very useful for thinking about this conversation and kind of where we want to go from here. So I am actually just going to kind of stop sharing my screen, and both Cami and Dominic, I'm going to invite you to come back on screen. And I know you have a couple slides as well, so you can direct me if there are certain ones that you want to pull up as you're talking through things. But I guess first and foremost, I would just ask kind of a general question, and I'll put it out to you, maybe Cami first, and then Dominic would love to get your point of view. Why is uniting widely necessary? Both from a scientific standpoint, but also just any experiences that you've had in that space. Why is it necessary?
Hi, Khalil. Can you hear me?
I can.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. This is, I think that I'm speaking from a science perspective in many ways, looking at also as a foreigner in this country, and thinking about uniting widely. When we think about it, it's way more important than we think about just bridging some of the gaps that we experience, because it's going back for me to our innate need to belong and to feel like we are understood, to feel like we are safe and protected in our environments. And when we go through a lot of different changes in life, the more we feel like we are part of the group, that we are united, that we have people behind us that are going to help us and support us, the safer we feel. And we will be discussing some of the challenges why this is not necessarily happening so easily for us as we would hope so in just a second. But I think that for me, it's when I think about uniting widely, it's all about belonging and feeling like I have support, or we have support. We can support each other and move mountains much better than doing it by yourself and trying to push the big stone up the hill, so to speak.
Yeah. And Dominic, we have the fortunate video, so I can see you also nodding your head. So I get that you don't completely disagree, but what would you add to that definition, or from your perspective?
I completely agree with Cami. And I would, I guess, highlight the moving mountains part. I think people have a real desire to engage in meaningful collective action, to feel bigger, like they're part of something bigger than just themselves. And that uniting people in pursuit of some sort of set of shared goals allows organizations and groups to tap into this huge reserve of human motivation that's often untapped. Organizations, businesses spend a lot of time talking about incentives and incentive structures, trying to get people to work smart and hard. But often we're most motivated and most excited about our work when it's part of something collective, when we feel like we're part of a team, we're pursuing something of real good and value, and it's not just us alone.
No, love that. All right, so let's start getting into some of the meat of this. So, Cami, I'm going to give you probably the first tough question of our time together. I think in a lot of ways, I personally, and I know a lot of others, like to think of ourselves as individuals. So would love to understand just like, what are some of the most effective ways to unite a diverse and individualistic group of people? How do you take people that say, no, I'm unique, I'm myself, I'm my own person, and bring us together? What can the science tell us about that?
There are quite a few different layers that we can think about it. Probably the most salient for us is aligning around the same shared goal. However, the importance of that would be actually doing it in a way that is not imposed by the dominant group, but rather it's done in a way that is viewed and valued across different identities, because we need to remember that even shared goals can be problematic if we are kind of trying to blanket statement everybody across the board. So remembering that we need to accommodate identity and kind of like come up with the contact theory, which we'll be discussing in a little bit, and making sure that the people that we are trying to unite around the shared goal actually have also their identity intact, meaning that the racial, the national identities, because otherwise if we do it just impose the shared goal, we actually are trying much more of into going into oppressive and exclusionary behavior rather than shared goals. So I think shared goals and experience exposure, kind of like letting the punchline that we are going to discuss at the end, but that would be a combination of quite a few factors: shared goals, identities, and understanding the experience that people will have.
Okay. Well, you know what? Let's actually go to some of the slides that I know you had put together. So I'll pop some of them up, and I'm sure they'll help to kind of guide some of the discussion that we want to have. So let me pull those up. And you
can I just interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah, please.
Just to add a little bit to that. So there's really interesting research, actually from probably about 20 years ago now, which actually suggests that feeling a sense of shared identity and part of something big and collective actually might have the greatest effect on people who are more individualistic. Which is really interesting. So they did this study where they essentially split people based on their personality into what they called prosocials, who were people who generally tended to contribute to a group no matter what, and a set of people they called individualists, who tended to they didn't necessarily hurt their group, but they were interested in their own personal outcomes. And if there was a sacrifice to be made, they tended to look out for their own interests rather than their groups. But then what they did for everybody is they made them feel, well, half of their participants made them feel like they were part of this important collective and that it was a social identity they cared about. And the pro-social people, it didn't change their behavior because they contributed either way, but it had a huge effect on the people who were more individualistic. Whereas if you hadn't made them feel like part of a group, they're pretty self-centered. And if you had made them feel like part of a group, it's like they're self-shifted to the group. And now they are actually contributing just as much and sacrificing just as much as the people who were pro-social based on their personalities.
All right, good to know. I'm learning a little bit about myself as well. So Cami, walk us through some of these slides. I'll go to the next one and then you can kind of direct me as necessary. But what are we getting at here?
Thank you so much. So I think that this is almost one of the, in linking us to identity, we know that as humans, we don't have just one identity. We have multiple nested identities, almost like the Russian dolls that you kind of like unpack. You know, like I'm a woman, I'm a scientist, I'm a dancer, I'm a painter, etc., etc. I'm Polish, so I'm disclosing quite a lot of information here to the audience, and that's one of the challenges, and also the benefits of us, or the really good things that we contribute as humans, the complexity of our identities. The challenge is that as humans, already from the infancy, we are very prone and predisposed to classify in-group and out-group members based on a lot of both biological traits, but also traits that are kind of like acquired, like which university I went to, which city I lived in, what type of food I eat, with whom I hang out with, etc. And because of that classification, we actually classify people as either friend or foe unconsciously, and that there is definitely an impact of that on a lot of different behaviors that we would have. Anything from perception, how we perceive other people, how we interact with other people, how we are motivated to help or actually hurt people, as Dominic will probably speak much more to that as well, but also how much empathy and how much shared experience we can have with other people. So when we think about this being such pronounced and such salient classification that happens outside of our awareness, especially children, already infants at the age of 3 months, they already have a show preference for their own race when they look at faces instead of the race of a different identity. And then we carry on with that classification through childhood, through adulthood, and we overlay so many different identities on top of that. We're actually facing quite a lot of immediate reactivity. And I think that even right now when I speak here, a lot of you can actually identify with me fairly easy, and some of you are very far away and you will be identifying much more with Dominic or much more with Khalil based on very different pieces of information that you tag as, oh, that's important, oh, I like this, oh, I can relate to this, oh, this is really like painter, I don't like paintings, etc. So we can actually classify a lot of this, and it has an implication. And one of the reasons, Khalil, if you can go to the next slide, is the reason why we classify and when we have this innate tendency to classify in-group and out-group is that the first and obvious one is we want to survive. We developed in groups, and as humans, we are not very feisty. In comparison to other animals, we can't protect ourselves and survive on our own, like looking evolutionarily specifically. So we do need the group. We do need to understand who is our in-group and who is our out-group, who can protect us and who can fight with us or who can actually harm us. The other aspect is we want to make sure that we reduce uncertainty in terms of how do I interact with this person? Can I trust them? Are they actually my in-group or out-group? How do I go and forge for berries, so to speak, with that person? And the last, which is not least, obviously, is our innate need to belong, which is kind of going back to uniting widely in a way that we really are developed and wired to belong to groups, to feel like we are accepted, that we feel much safer when we are in a group than we are on the outside, and we have a whole system that is designed to protect us from being on the outskirts, so to speak. And Khalil, if you go to the next slide, is the next, we can go. Thank you. The three main concepts, or the three main implications, so to speak, or impact of this in-group and out-group classification that we do is the perception, motivation, and empathy, as I mentioned earlier, meaning that we perceive those from our in-group in a very different way than we do those who we classify as our out-group. We are also in, and that I think that Dominic, maybe you can help us go through this in terms of just perception. We think of those who belong into our in-group. We think of them as, sometimes depending when it's a team sport, we think of them as faster, we think of them as better, we think of them as more relatable than the other group. We think about also from the just looking at other people, when it comes to the out group, others can show up as threat for us, as psychological and physiological threat, and that's going to also impact how we interact with the out-group members. And Dominic, I know that you're off mute. Would you like to add something before we go to the motivation and empathy links?
No, carry on.
Awesome. Okay. So then when it comes to, like, maybe Khalil, maybe you can go to the next slide when we have the Schadenfreude and other aspects of the impact of motivation, empathy and perception. So you can see we've already discussed that we feel more favorably to people, to those in our in-group, and less favorably to those of our out-group. We also have very different empathic response, meaning that we feel pain, we feel the joy of those who we consider our in-group, but we are actually feeling there are quite a few different studies showing that when people when those members of our out-group get hurt physically, they experience pain. Usually in experimental setting, we are not very nice to our subjects and we shock them with electric shocks, and those who are observing people from outside of the group, they actually get a reward response. So we get pleasure from seeing those of our out group getting a little bit of an electric shock in the experimental setting. So that's the Schadenfreude response, and it's the opposite to what we feel when we see somebody who we associated as our in-group getting shocked or getting pain or getting psychological pain, even being excluded from a team. And the same almost applies to motivation. For those who we consider our in-group, we are much more likely to show kindness and help, and we are much more likely to help rather than those of our out-group who we are more likely to hurt, or we almost get the pleasure of their misfortune. It's the two different German words, the Schadenfreude and Glücksschmerz, is going to kind of, they impact the same way, or they kind of belong to the same category, but they have different impact. One is pain and pleasure that we experience between in-group and out-group, and the other one is the misfortune. Like we get pleasure from those misfortune of others. And that's specifically, we can see that in sports. You can see that the divisions of in-group and out-group in sports, it's so pronounced and it can be so easily manipulated, but the emotions are running raw in terms of us winning, our team winning, we get so much pleasure, and when they are losing, it's actually hurtful to us to watch. And Dominic, I would love to hear from you. I know that you've done quite a few studies and you know a lot about the research of Ingroup-Outgroup with Jay Van Bevel and sports, so it would be awesome to hear from you.
And actually, if I can ask you a specific question, Dominic, because I think there are a couple things that come out for me, you know, when I hear a part of this. One is, are there downsides to creating in-group? And I think kind of the subcontext of that is, does there have to be an out-group in order for there to be an in-group? And can you have too much of a good thing? Can it be bad that, yay, we're all one team now and we've all come together, and so that means that everybody else is on the outside and we want nothing to do with them? Or is there a way to find kind of a universal benefit that we can lift everybody up at the same time?
It's a really, really great question. I think, I mean, sort of definitionally, if you have an in-group, there must be other groups, right? If you define your group as all of humanity, you're implying there's, you know, animal species or perhaps aliens who are, outside of that. But nevertheless, I think if you're in a position of leadership and you're trying to unite people around some sort of coherent identity, there's different strategies, only one of which is really highlighting divisions between your group and other groups. It's a strategy that's often used, and there's contexts where it's not problematic, right? I think the sort of sporting context is one where it can be a lot of healthy competition is a good thing. But there's contexts where it's not a good thing. And fortunately, there are other means by which you can foster and build group identities by focusing on who are we, right? What are our traditions? What are our symbols? What are our stories? What do we value? And research shows that both of these are ways in which you can build identities. I think another potential pitfall with this idea of unite widely, and I've seen it pop up in the comments a couple of times, is people come to organizations with, as Cami said, a host of identities, some of which are very important to them. There's this idea in social psychology, which I think has already been referenced, known as optimal distinctiveness, which is that we have this sort of these dual drives, these competing motivations. On the one hand, we really do want to belong to something. And this is a very important human motive, as Cami's talked about. At the same time, we don't want to have to give up the rest of ourselves simply to belong. We want to maintain a level of uniqueness at the individual level, but also maintain other identities that are really important to us, right? So you go to work and you bring your gender identity with you, and you don't necessarily want to leave that at the door. You bring your racial identity with you, and you don't want to necessarily have to leave that at the door. And I think increasingly what we're seeing is that people are coming to work and they don't want to have to leave all of these other parts of themselves at the door. And the challenge for organizations is how do you do that? How do you create environments where people can achieve that sort of level of optimal distinctiveness, where yes, we are united as an organization or a team around a set of shared goals, but we also have room for people to bring their own unique experiences, talents, as well as some of the challenges they're facing outside of work, and have it be a welcoming place that's accepting of all of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Cami, there's a slide that you had put together that I'm going to pop back up that I'd love for you to maybe kind of talk us through, because it brings in this idea of fluidity. And I think that is a really valuable idea, that we are not kind of fixed in a particular place, and our in-group is always our in-group and is always going to be our in-group, but rather that there is some degree of flexibility that we can be more aware of and more in control of. So I would love for you to maybe kind of talk us through what this means and how we use that as leaders.
Yes, absolutely. And you were reading my mind. I was just going to tell you, can you please pop up the fluidity slide? Because it's really important what Dominic mentions, all of those identities, we do bring them, and we can't really shed one of them. If we do at a cost, essentially, like say the psychological cost, that will be very challenging for us. And then we'll feel like we are missing a piece of us at work, or we are not seen. And I think that it's really important to remember for us that even though we do classify in-group and out-group really, really fast and automatically, we can also go in and out of that out-group and in-group. If the easiest example is thinking about friends. The moment something happens in friendships, we are very in-group and we are going along. And then if there is a breakdown in friendship, whether it's a betrayal or whether it's a fight about something that is long-lasting, that is actually it actually makes us more go into the out group, because our goals are not the same, our values are not the same. So there is a lot of different levers that we can pull to switch between in and out group, and as you can see here on the top is the primary one, or one of the important ones is the superordinate goals. There's also the understanding of identity, so the positive intergroup contact that allows for identities to be kept with actually integrating the shared goal that is shared across many different identities and people. But also the perspective taking, we keep coming back to understanding and understanding the experience of others through perspective taking and perspective getting. And the moment we actually bridge or make the distance between two people, out group and in group, a little bit smaller, by understanding the perspective of where they are coming from, how they experience the world, what are the concepts and what are the factors that play into the decision making, is also much easier than to create much more of the in-group. Like just having the small nuggets of information makes it easier for us to turn the tables, so to speak. Like, oh, suddenly I feel like I have a connection with this person that I didn't realize that I did have. And it can be the other way around. So we need to be careful. The more salient and polarizing ideas we put forefront, the more challenges we may be having with actually bringing people in group if the polarization is very salient right now, because we'll be paying attention to the polarization much more, to the differences, to the distinctiveness much more, and that creates the more of the out-group, in-group dichotomy rather than bringing everybody in group with subordinate goals and perspective taking, etc. And I think that in organizations, it's really important to remember that, to think that even when we get this very diverse population, we keep talking to our clients about the importance of inclusion, and one of the mitigation strategies to find commonalities with everybody, not the same commonality with everybody, but the commonality between me and Mary, me and Khalil, me and Dominic, the things that are different for us, for each of us, but we have the thing together, and that actually can allow for to bring a little bit more in-group perspective, even though the distinctiveness, as Dominic was mentioning earlier, is going to be kept, because I'm not losing my identity as a European suddenly when we actually geek out about the brain with Dominic. So there is a different, we are nesting the identities while keeping our own identities intact and respected.
Yes. And you and I are finding different things to connect with, because we're not geeking out about the brain in the same way, but we do have a lot of other similarities that totally come together. So it's interesting, you know, in some ways, I would love for either one of you that feels comfortable with it, kind of describing what is entitivity, because we have that on the slide in a couple different places and some people have asked in the chat. The other thing that I would call out though is I love kind of this connection to perspective taking, because one of the things that comes up quite frequently is we have these Your Brain at Work, you know, sessions, or we have all of this work that comes together. And 2 weeks ago, we had Dr. Jamil Zaki from Stanford on to talk about empathy. And we spent quite a bit of time talking, Cami, very similar to what you were just describing in terms of perspective taking and perspective getting. And so these things really do weave together. There's a lot of connection and a lot of kind of relationship between and amongst them. But would anybody like to explain what we're talking about by diminishing and increasing entitivity?
I can take that one. Yeah. It's widely agreed by social psychologists to be the worst term in social psychology. That should pronounce entitivity. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm not saying that anymore. You get to say that one from now on.
It's a bad term. But basically, it's the extent to which you see the group as a group, or how groupy it is. And you can think of it as how porous are the boundaries, right? So a highly entitative group is one in which it's a clear entity. You're in or you're out. We have very firm borders, and inside we're all pretty similar to each other. Mm-hmm. And then a less entitative group would be one where you've got porous boundaries. You can come, you can go, or you can be in this group, but also in other groups, and we're not all identical to one another. Mm. And generally speaking, the less you see a group as entitative, the more open you are to outsiders, to divergent views, and so on.
Makes a lot of sense. Good. I want to get us to kind of how to scale some of this and what it means to kind of take this into practice, because we've talked a little bit about what it is, what some of the challenges may be. I know there are a lot of folks that are asking questions like, okay, so what do we do with all of this now? And I'm going to bounce to another slide that we had before. And Cami, I'm going to come back to you. So one thing that I would love to do is kind of introduce the poll, and Gabe, maybe if we can do the second poll that we had. Now that we've talked a little bit about what Uniting Widely looks like, do you believe that your leaders are very prepared to do what we've been talking about in terms of bringing people together, creating in-group, finding these shared goals, creating these shared experiences? And then, Cami, I would love to talk a bit about specifically what should leaders be doing. So there are 3 things that we've kind of identified that we think are really relevant in this space, but would love to know, just based on what we've described up until now, how prepared do we think our leaders are to do this? And we'll give it like another 20 seconds. Gabe, what do you got for us?
Well, about to share the results, but I also just wanted to call out that folks on LinkedIn Live unfortunately aren't able to see the poll, but in the comments, people can feel free to leave their their votes as well.
Absolutely, and good call out. So the question would be that I believe that right now our leaders are either A, very prepared to unite widely, or I'm sorry, A, very unprepared to unite widely, B, somewhat unprepared to unite widely, C, somewhat prepared to unite widely, or D, prepared, very prepared, and kind of number 5, I don't know. And so what we're seeing here is that about 15% say that they believe their leaders are very unprepared to unite widely. About 29% are saying they believe their leaders are somewhat unprepared. 14% are saying, I don't know. 36%, which is our kind of largest share, are saying that they believe their leaders are somewhat prepared to unite widely. And 6% are saying that we believe our leaders are very prepared to unite widely. So I want to kind of give, Cami, you a little bit of space to talk about some things that we can do and things that we can be equipping our leaders to do to really focus on uniting widely. And I'm going to bring this slide back up so you can talk us through kind of these 3 elements and what these mean and what we should be doing with leaders.
Absolutely. Thanks, Khalil. So I've already kind of like let the cat out of the bag at the beginning, saying that when we think about what we can do, there are, among many other things, but there are 3 main, 3 core facets that we can think of 3 core factors that leaders can think of and understand the drawbacks and also the benefits that we've been already discussing to make sure that they unite widely. You can see on the screen there are 3 main: exposure, experience, and shared goals. And even though they are connected concepts, they also have distinctive parts. So the exposure part is just understanding that sheer exposure in terms of creating a diverse workforce, but just being with other people around us, we can create an exposure that can actually help with then bridging experience and shared goals much better. The important thing is to remember, though, that in organizations, we already have a power dynamic and structural systems that are by default exclusionary. So when we think about the structure of a big corporation and the C-suite is on the level on floor 7 and the mailroom is only on the ground floor, we are already creating the structure that is limiting the exposure in quite significant manner in terms of different groups and different identities bridging and kind of going in between each other to be exposed to each other's behavior and actions and different way of reacting. And it's something that we need to be aware of. This is not to say that leaders we need to scramble the offices and make everything on one floor, but there is definitely a structural and hierarchical obstacle that is already there for us, and addressing that exposure level would be really important to mitigate some of the obstacles that would show up when it comes to unite widely. Very similar is the concept of experience. Experience, when we were talking previously, is not just doing something with other people, but understanding how they are experiencing that. We are sharing emotions when we are interacting with other people, and the aspect of perception and experience are indistinct. I mean, they are connected very much so. You can't have perspective taking without experience, and you can't really have experience without understanding perspectives of your own, but also on of other people. And you think that sometimes the exposure and experience can be challenging. Imagine inviting the C-suite level invites all the low managers, or let's think about the lab rather. If the lab professor invites his or her students to a party and they bring cheaper wine because they have a different status, different socioeconomical status, the experience and the exposure of that is already shifted in some ways that is not the most optimal. So correcting or accounting for those differences that are there structurally would be very important to enable the experience to be much more cohesive and beneficial rather than polarizing again and exposing some of the challenges. And then that links.
And Kami, just really quickly, I was going to say that to me, that kind of, I was looking through, I think it might have been Twitter earlier today, and someone was referencing golf outings and saying that for them, that was a perfect encapsulation of what you're describing, which is in an effort to be inclusive, the senior leader said, well, let's all go out and golf. And yet, you know, people's exposure to it, their experience with it, their comfort level around it was so varied that experience didn't actually increase exposure or kind of share goals in the way that they would have hoped it would. So like that jumped out to me as you were talking through it.
Absolutely, and the same concept refers to the golfing is one aspect. It's very similar is like the old boys club, when we have we invite when you think about gender diversity, we invite and we have diverse workforce, but then we go and do things that are specific, much more specific to one group over another. So again, like this, we are kind of by default, by assuming something that we are doing it right, we are not taking account the identity that Dominic was mentioning earlier. And we are almost exacerbating the challenges rather than make it better. And then it's linked to the shared goals. We also can think about the assimilation aspects and creating an identity, shared identity or shared goal for many different identities, but there needs to be a space that is then linked to the exposure and experience that allows for the identities to show up and allows for those who don't want to golf but want to do something else, that they can also participate in a different activity that is not exclusionary if they don't have the golf clubs, they've never been to a golf course. There are structural things that we need to pay attention to. And I know that I can see that Dominic is nodding.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's get you in there. And then I want to go to the chat as well. So folks, if you have questions, feel free to put them in there. We're going to try and get to as many as we can, but Dominic, would love to hear your reaction to kind of exposure, experience, shared goals, things that are kind of jumping out at you.
I agree with everything Kami just said. So there's a long history of research on contact between groups. It's a really intuitive thing, right? If you get members of different groups to interact, surely they'll learn about each other and come to like each other more. And this can only be a good thing for intergroup relations. And what we've seen historically is that it doesn't always work out that way, right? Interactions don't always go well. And one of the things Kami's talking a lot about is the hierarchy. And so we know quite a lot about what you need in place to have those interactions be fruitful ones, that people actually do start to like each other more and empathize with each other more and engage in that perspective taking. And one of them is equal status or power. And it turns out to be crucial. It doesn't help very much if, you know, every male in your organization is in a high status role and every female is in a low status role. They're going to interact a lot, but it's not necessarily going to improve gender relations or certainly improve the status of those women. And I think what this really speaks to is the importance of representation of groups at all levels of your organization, right? Mm-hmm. You need people of underrepresented racial groups, you need women, you need other kind of minorities at the top of your organization so that there really is equal power and equal status as people interact across group lines. I think that's a critical thing. And then the only other thing I'd say is that when you're talking about scaling, like, I mean, it's the $1 million question, how do you scale these kind of things? Early on, you had this slide where I think the majority of respondents had said that what most of the information they were getting about this kind of thing was, you know, messaging from CEOs in the form of a memo or an email or maybe some sort of mission statement. All I can say with regard to that is that people are watching what you do just as much or perhaps more than what you say, right? Mm-hmm. That it's a nice thing to say these things. We have shared goals, that we are all on board with a particular human rights issue, for example. But they're going to be looking to see, where's your budget going? Yep. Are you spending money in these areas? How do you treat violations, right? Like if there's behaviors that are problematic at work, what's happening, right? Yeah. Are you responsive to those? Are you attending to those? What kind of metrics are you collecting, right? Are you interested in inclusion statistics? You know, not just how well are you hiring diverse groups, but are people sticking around? Do people want to stay in your company over time? And if you're not collecting the data, or you're not interested in it, or you're not spending the money where it needs to get spent, then the words ultimately come across as hollow And there aren't going to be shared goals, right? No matter what you say.
Yeah, such a great point. And I think there's going to be a lot of connectivity to what we'll talk about next week in terms of Act Boldly. But I love, the connection that you made, Dominic, as well to the idea of representation, because I know for many of the folks on the line, this comes back to, so what should I be doing in my organization? What should we be doing in our organization? And we do see at times some of that stratifying that happens where it's like, well, in our call center, we've got incredible diversity, and that absolutely buoys the numbers in our organization. And yet at the more senior levels, it's not there. And so what are some of the things we can do, and what are some of the implications around that? I do want to go really quickly to a question that came in from LinkedIn, which is, or LinkedIn Live, which is a bit of a challenging one for you two. So I apologize in advance. The question is there a point of no return when an out-group is dehumanized by the in-group? So is there, and maybe not even dehumanized, but is there ever a point where you would just say, unfortunately, the relations have devolved so far that it's going to be virtually impossible to use some of the things that we're describing to shift? Or is there always a way to create the shared goals and the experiences and the exposure that would create the change that we're talking about?
That's a great question, Dominic, and I definitely want to lean on you as well. I think that my response to that would be, I hope there is always a chance. The thing that we need to remember is that at some point when essentially a conflict reaches such an aggravated state, there needs to be concession, obvious and transparent and consistent concessions to bring the trust back, to eliminate some of the discrepancies and some of the kind of like confrontational attitudes that were there to begin with. So I think that it's not a matter of let's just discuss this, because at the end of the day, mindset is one thing, but the structure around the mindset in which we are operating, that needs to change. So sometimes we think, oh, if we just have a growth mindset, or if we just think differently, it's going to change. But we come out of those discussions and we go back to the world in which all the other media and everything that we are surrounded, our neighborhoods, everything is kind of like creating and sending the signals of different saliency. So I think that we need to think about it from a structure perspective and mindset perspective. We can't just go one and hope that there's going to be a change. That would be my response. I'm hopeful. Dominic, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, I agree. I'm hopeful, but it can be incredibly difficult if it's reached the point of dehumanization, which is often a very dangerous point to be at. Where people are now seeing other people as less than human. Good things never come from that. And I think there are certainly historic examples of groups getting past it, but it takes a huge amount of work. It takes a huge amount of leadership. You can think about contexts like South Africa at the end of apartheid, right? The truth and reconciliation process was probably not entirely successful, but certainly made strides toward reconciling relations between white and Black South Africans. But it was incredible leadership that got them there, and really difficult process to go through. There's a really nice study, I'm forgetting the name of the author, which I regret, but of a researcher who did work in northern Iraq after ISIS, which had occupied the territory, left. And while ISIS was there were both Christian and Muslim residents who essentially fled and then came back to a incredibly, war-torn region of the country, and with really, disrupted relations between the two groups. And as this research project, what they did is they created local soccer teams involving teenage boys, I think. And on some teams, they were all from one religion. There were either Christian teams or Muslim teams. And on other teams, they were assigned to mixed religion teams, where it was half Muslim boys and half Christian boys. And they played in the soccer league for a season, and then they followed them up over time, and they found that the boys who had played on the mixed religion teams subsequently had significantly better relations with members of other religious groups, were more excited about playing in a mixed religious league the next year. And that kind of cooperative, unified, we want to win as a soccer team environment was conducive to those relations. But I would, in closing, I guess, of this remark, just go back to what Cami was saying about ultimately structures really matter. And you can't just say, oh, it's all great. These boys liked each other more, and say, job done. You also want to pay attention to what's the conditions on the ground for these people, for their families. Do they have equal opportunity? Because if you don't address those problems, ultimately, you're not going to solve the bigger issue.
Love it. What a great place for us to kind of wrap, because I know we're coming up on the top of the hour, but I love this idea of, we're all, I think, cautiously optimistic, right? That the research can inform some of that. And yet what I heard you both say is that leadership really matters, structures really matter, following through on the behaviors that we're describing and kind of the pros and cons of that really matter. And so that's an amazing kind of takeaway for our group. So I'm going to put a couple slides back up, and Gabe, I think you're going to give us a poll. I will just say, Dominic and Cami, thank you so much for this conversation. I always learn a ton when I talk to both of you and either of you. So Gabe, maybe toss that poll up, and I'm going to talk us through a couple other key things as well.